Welcome to this series, Culture, Scripture, and Ethics, Reflections for a 21st Century Church. I'm Chris Berriger, pastor of the Church of St. Mark and St. Peter, Montreal, Canada. This is the introduction. There are countless issues that Christians face through the course of life, and for which they seek guidance from Scripture, but which the Bible does not directly address. This, though, should not be surprising, for the Bible is not a systematic rulebook. Rather, the Bible is a collection of many types of literature, written by several dozen authors over many centuries, collected together over time to form the Jewish and Christian scriptures. From these texts, followers of Jesus then discern or work out implications of Scripture for the issues they face in their own time and place. Over the centuries, the questions of life and faith faced by Christians in different times and places, in different cultural contexts, have been very different from each other, and it would have been impossible for Scripture to have foreseen and addressed all the issues that could possibly arise for all Christians in all cultures and contexts. The purpose of Scripture, then, is not to be an answer book for every question that could arise anywhere at any time. Rather, Scripture provides believers with a range of foundational stories and teachings and writings to form us, individually and collectively, to be people of Jesus for our time and place. And part of that shaping process involves wrestling with Scripture, to figure out how Scripture applies to the issues that arise in one's own context. I use the word wrestle intentionally because this word alludes to the new name given to Jacob by God in Genesis 32, namely Israel, meaning the one who wrestled with God. Jews very much see themselves as wrestling with Scripture and with God and with each other to understand the nature of God and God's ways. This is not wrestling in a competitive sense, as if there must be a winner and a loser, but rather in the sense of the back and forth process of assessing the various angles that bear on any particular question, and doing this together within the faith community. So this series is about wrestling with Scripture, and with Christian tradition more broadly, to discern how 21st century Christians in the Western world should live within our context today. This means then describing our context today. So I set the stage for this series by describing what I see as three of the dominant value systems underlying Western society today, because these so deeply affect how we think and act. And yet people often don't recognize these values operating within society or within themselves. These three value systems are hyper-individualism, otherwise known as libertarianism; the common good, otherwise known as communitarianism; and humanitarianism. To repeat, these are hyper-individualism, the common good, and humanitarianism. My desire is that Christians be able to recognize and identify these values, recognize how they operate in society and within themselves, and respond Christianly, whether with critique or with support. As we will see, though, I do have deep concern about one of these values in particular, hyper-individualism. For I and others believe it causes significant but sometimes difficult to recognize harms to both society and Christian life. Some listeners will rightly ask, well, aren't there other values such as capitalism or postmodernism or humanism or nationalism or nihilism, or perhaps others which should also be included? To which I'd reply, yes indeed. And the topics ahead will touch on many of these, but I won't have space here to address them directly, important as they are. So I'll have to leave these for another day. And this is because of my primary concern, namely with today's hyper-individualism. Scholars call it libertarianism, though I prefer the term hyper-individualism simply because it's more descriptive. I and others are greatly concerned by the rise of hyper-individualist values over the past 60 years. These come in three streams: political, economic, and social. The political stream is the least influential of the three, being mostly confined to small libertarian parties in some countries, most notably in the USA. The economic stream, known as neoliberal economics, has been very influential globally for the past 40 years, classically represented by the economic policies of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The social stream represents hyper-individualist values in everyday life and culture. In this series, I will not be addressing hyper-individualism's political and economic forms. Rather, I will be addressing its social forms. I and other thinkers, both secular and Christian, believe that hyper-individualist social values have become so pervasive within Western values today that they are often just intuitively accepted as today's moral norm, even if people do not have language to name it. Yet, if hyper-individualism actually causes harm, then what are these harms? Well, they include, for instance, the following. Laissez-faire capitalism, which is capitalism unrestrained by regulations to protect the population at large from predatory corporate practices. High gun culture, which advocates the right to ownership and public carrying of any kind of firearms, with the resulting elevated rates of gun deaths that we see in the USA, for instance. Unconstrained consumerism, which causes harm to the environment, as well as causing existential emptiness about any deeper meaning to life. Sexual libertinism, which leaves people cynical about the possibility of trust, deep vulnerability, and faithful relational commitment. And diminished experience of community, leading at the individual level to greatly increased rates of isolation and mental health issues, including loneliness, anxiety, and narcissism, and leading at the societal level to a diminished sense of social cohesion, and thus a greater sense of social division in society, along with a diminished sense of collective responsibility to each other in society. And this is only a partial list of the harms of hyper-individualism. But so often the hyper-individualist roots of these problems go unrecognized because of the individual freedoms that hyper-individualism promotes and celebrates. Which brings us to the heart of social hyper-individualism, namely maximizing individual freedom of choice. Especially two types of choice above all, unconstrained or minimally constrained consumer choice and sexual choice. Yet my concern through this series is not only to recognize these particular harms I've just listed, but also that people come to recognize hyper-individualist assumptions, patterns, and values in other areas of life as well, in order to say, maybe there are some harms being caused in other areas of life that I or society aren't seeing simply because we are so used to viewing our life through a hyper-individualist lens. Because to see some part of life through another lens than the currently dominant lens in society seems weird at minimum and perhaps even immoral. In due course, I will propose an alternative lens or value system to that of hyper-individualism. My proposal will draw from both Christian and non-Christian sources, for all truth is God's truth wherever it is found. I will describe the foundations of my proposal in Christian language, while at the same time providing alternative language for Christians to use when talking about these things in secular contexts. For example, secular language uses the word ethics, but I will also use Jesus' phrase in Matthew 5 of greater righteousness. So in the episodes ahead, I will use both the secular term ethics and the Christian term greater righteousness interchangeably as we address issues today. Yet I also offer the reflections in this series with another motive as well, a desire to encourage thinking from a third perspective, a perspective that challenges the conservative-progressive divide within so much discussion today across virtually any subject. My reflections on ethics in general and sexuality in particular do not fit cleanly into these two boxes. For my theology leads me at times to positions that overlap with views that are often considered conservative, while at other times to overlap positions that are often considered progressive. Indeed, as we look at the life and teaching of Jesus, we see a similar pattern in him. On some matters he took an approach that was contextually conservative, such as having come not to abolish the Torah, but to fulfill it. While on other matters he was contextually progressive, such as how he engaged with women. At the same time, we also need to remember that in Jesus' context, both religious and political leaders saw him as a radical, wanting to bring deep change to deeply held beliefs and practices. Indeed, his practice of love of God and love of neighbor so profoundly overturned certain values of his day that he got himself executed for it. I believe such radically applied love of God and love of neighbor provides an equally profound challenge to the hyper-individualist values of our day. How? Let me turn here to today's conservative-progressive divide. I believe that both conservatives and progressives are subject to the same human strengths and failings, the same sorts of cognitive biases when addressing any issue. These strengths, weaknesses, and biases just get played out differently by each respective party. In my view, this means that both progressives and conservatives can hold views that, depending on the topic, have valid, even important insights into human well-being. While, at the same time, both progressives and conservatives can also hold erroneous views that can cause harm. An important source of the harms caused by both conservatives and progressives is a surprising source of commonality between them, that both of them often adopt hyper-individualism as a moral starting point, though they apply hyper-individualist values in different ways. We'll see this in due course. But my larger view here is that both conservatives and progressives are capable of both truth and harm. This is not an intentional effort on my part to be centrist. Centrism can be just as erroneous as any other position, depending on the matter at hand. Rather, I want to try my best to place truth and rightness over party loyalty. For party loyalty is an imperfect way of arriving at truth or wisdom. There is good reason for this strong human inclination to align oneself with parties or tribes or traditions. Life is full of questions, but with all the responsibilities of life, there's no way any of us can find the time and resources to deeply investigate all life's questions. We may be able to find the time to investigate some of these questions on our own, such as by reading books or blogs or watching YouTube videos. But few of us have the time or resources to fully investigate all our questions. And so we need to find a source for answers we trust. And we do this by aligning ourselves with certain traditions or parties that we decide are trustworthy, and then using this tradition or party as our default source or go-to source for answers or direction. We all do this, conservatives and progressives alike. And indeed, this is an appropriate practice given life's limitations. The problem comes, however, when we subconsciously invest infallibility in the tradition or tribe with which we align ourselves. Protestants and secularists alike critique the doctrine of infallibility of the Roman Catholic Church. Infallibility is the belief that, under particular circumstances, the Pope can never be wrong. Yet Protestants and secularists, both conservative and progressive, can end up operating with virtually the same attitude of infallibility towards the views of their own party. A key reason for this is often for a sense of security. For an attitude of infallibility enables us to avoid recognizing or assessing any cracks in the view of my own party. For people can feel unequipped to answer the following sort of question. How do I assess if a crack in my party's worldview is just a crack needing some minor revision, or if this one crack will actually lead to the unraveling of my tribe's whole worldview? Then this problem intensifies when we align our chosen tradition with our personal identity, in which case any critique of my tradition then becomes a critique of me. And I don't want to critique myself, so I won't allow any critique of my tradition. Furthermore, we can be hesitant to verbalize openness to or sympathy with a specific idea or view from outside our own party, because we're afraid of the consequences, such as being mocked by or marginalized from our community for showing such sympathy. Again, this applies to both religious and secular tribes, conservative or progressive. For all these reasons, people can have a strong reticence to ever give a fair hearing to the views of another tradition, or admit that the tradition to which they align themselves might be at least partly wrong on some matter. Consequently, we find ourselves in a rigidly divided society today, in which there is limited space within either conservative or progressive ranks to say, well, I agree with such and such part of my tradition, but on this other particular issue, I think the other party actually has a valid point we need to listen to. From a Christian perspective, however, no human traditions are fully correct about everything they believe, and so God seeks to correct all traditions. Thus, while it is quite appropriate to have tribal allegiances, and I have my own, we must hold our allegiances with a sense of openness to critique, an openness to the possibility that another party, even an opposing party, might have something valid and truthful that my party, including me, needs to listen to and change in ourselves if necessary. The position I'm advocating, which sees both conservatives and progressives as capable of both truths and errors, can be unpopular and thus uncomfortable. Not only because this means not being able to listen exclusively to the views of my party for answers to every issue, but rather having to do something far more difficult, trying to hear and evaluate with fairness arguments from multiple sides, rather than just reacting against a position simply because it's not the position held by my party. The case of Cornelius and the Jerusalem leaders in Acts 10-11, which I'll describe further in Part 2, gives an important biblical example of this, providing what I will call the Cornelius principle, that God uses unexpected voices, even distrusted voices, from outside the church to correct the church. Consequently, in the chapters ahead, the reader will encounter views that don't fit cleanly into either conservative or progressive boxes. Now let me describe the 4 parts to this video series. Part 1. Interpreting Western Society Today. Here we will examine in more depth not only the 3 value systems I've already mentioned, but where they've come from historically. This historical perspective is a really important part of understanding how to assess them for today. So there will be 5 chapters in Part 1. 3 value systems, a closer look. Jesus, Paul, and the emergence of individualism. The emergence of liberal individualism. The emergence of hyper-individualism. And why hyper-individualism fails humanity. Then Part 2. Thinking Christianly about ethics. Here I'll provide some core ideas for how Christians can respond to the hyper-individualism of our age. I will especially discuss the moral role of community in the New Testament, the meaning of Jesus' phrase, greater righteousness, the nature of virtue, and the concept of natural law, including the principle of freeing constraints. Then Part 3 will be on sexuality and human well-being. Part 4, consumerism and economic discipleship. I've chosen the topics in Parts 3 and 4, sexuality and consumerism, because unconstrained consumer choice and sexual choice represent the 2 dominant values promoted by social hyper-individualism today. In Part 3, I will propose a picture of what individual and societal well-being looks like when it comes to sexuality. Along the way, I will critique developments in secular Western sexual values, including today's sexual culture. Yet at the same time, there are also parts of our culture's sexual values which I believe are positive, indeed which have produced beneficial critique of Christian tradition. In other words, there will be points in Part 3 where I offer strident critique of contemporary sexual ethics, and yet there will also be points where I believe the Cornelius principle applies to Christians. Then in Part 4, I will examine consumerism, which takes us into economic discipleship. Well, finally, I have a request for you. I'd be grateful if you could hit the like, subscribe, and share buttons, so the YouTube algorithm gives this series some wider exposure. Now then, on to Chapter 1, a deeper look at these 3 social value systems in our society today.